You're listening to CJLO 1690 AM in Montreal, and this is The Worlds We Want, a podcast that explores the bright side of global climate change, namely the part where we change things for the better.
This is Cheryl.
This is Tristan, and this is episode 14. We're going to use today's show to explore the idea of making cities. At first, we were going to explore this idea of smart cities, but we decided not to wade in too deeply into that, because, to be honest, we aren't really sold on the idea yet. The idea of smart cities is kind of exciting right now, but we are not as excited about this as some might imagine. I think right off the bat, when a movement is being proposed as the quote-unquote smart version of something, it comes off sounding a bit like a glittering generality.
We will make America great again.
Like the notion of a political party that is pro-freedom and aims at fiscal responsibility. Well, duh, sign me up. Who's gonna say, no thanks, I don't want a smart city? Here is a little clip from CNBC talking about the smart cities of the world.
Just how smart is your city? Chances are it's getting smarter by the year. Many governments around the globe are racing to infuse technology into just about every aspect of its city's operations. And I mean every part.
Including public transportation, IT connectivity, water and power supply, sanitation and solid waste management, efficient urban mobility, e-governance, and citizen participation.
And it does this using every buzzword imaginable, from big data to the Internet of Things.
So how does a smart city work? Let's look at 3 examples.
Here in Singapore, the city-state might be the gold standard of the most extensive effort to collect data on daily living.
The government is now deploying systems that can tell when people are smoking in prohibited zones or littering from high-rise housing.
Singapore launched its own Smart Nation program in 2014 and will add more cameras like these so the government can effectively monitor crowd density, cleanliness of public spaces, and even the exact movement of every locally registered vehicle.
Much of the data it's collecting will be fed into an online platform called Virtual Singapore that gives the government access to how the city is functioning in real time. It could help the government predict how crowds might react to an explosion in a shopping mall, or how infectious disease might spread. Over in Dubai, more than 50 smart services from 22 government entities have been rolled out as part of the government's Smart Dubai initiative. Using the government-provided app Dubai Now, you can do things like pay a speeding ticket, which likely captured you on a public camera and then emailed you the ticket directly. You can also use the same app to pay your electric bill, call a taxi, track a package you sent to your friend, find the nearest ATM, renew your vehicle registration, track the visa status of a relative, and report a violation to the Dubai police.
But be careful what you report, ladies, because it could mean prison time for you too, the victim. Because this smart city is located in a sovereign constitutional monarchy with medieval laws that include things like flogging, stoning, and forced disappearances and torture. Just a few things that technology won't fix. The notion of smart cities, as they've come to be understood, have many unstated assumptions. For example, that efficiency is a central aim of a sustainable future, and that data and technology increases this efficiency, and all of this creates economic development, which in turn enhances the quality of life for people living and working in the city. The end. Sounds good, right? Is this even how it works? Cities are complex systems full of people, and people are doubly complex.
Firstly, we've known since the 19th century that resource efficiency doesn't always lead to decreases in the demand for that resource. This is called Jevons paradox. It's true that technology can make us more efficient, especially more time efficient. Just think of what the light bulb has done for the length of our days, and how much more quickly we are able to get from New York to London thanks to air travel. But it does not follow that all technology makes us more efficient, or that this efficiency is what leads to better lives. Don't get me wrong, I'm very happy to have modern medicine and indoor plumbing, but it doesn't follow that I'm happy to have my whereabouts tracked by my phone, my most important political discussions on Twitter, and my meetups with friends on Facebook. Just because some amount of a given thing makes life better, it doesn't follow that ever more of this continues to make life better. To believe this is to assume monotonicity. That is, that preferences are linear. This is not often the case when you take into account the cost of a given benefit. Some food is better than none, but ever more food comes with a cost on your body. Likewise, texting is a wonderful tool, but sometimes it's easier to actually talk with another person. So while we know that urban citizens all over the world are dealing with a variety of issues pertaining to the changing times, some are actively considering how technology might contribute to making cities more livable. For today's show, we wanted to look into an example of what people did when they made part of the city their own. What would they do? Why would they do it? And how would they do it? With this in mind, we made a little field trip. We went out to visit Bâtiment 7, located in Montreal's historic Pointe Saint-Charles. Bâtiment 7, which translates literally into Building 7, is a heritage industrial building that has been converted into a community-led space for alternative projects. The project's mission is to collectively manage the property in pursuit of artistic, cultural, social, and political services and activities that are championed by members in response to the needs and desires of the district. Further, they aim to create an autonomous ecosystem that encourages experimentation and learning in a way that builds and sustains connections, interdependence, complementarity, and resource sharing. While we were at Bâtiment 7, we sat down with Alex Megelas, Programs and Communications Coordinator for the Office of Community Engagement at Concordia University, where he oversees the University of Streets Café, a popular education program. Alex is also a PhD student in educational studies at McGill University, where his research considers the role of informal spaces in fostering social movements.
Just to be clear, while Alex works for the university does not own or run this space. We asked him to explain what he's up to exactly. Just a note, this is also a very active space, and there are sounds in the space that come from being used by people, including children.
As an Office of Community Engagement, we're tasked with exploring a broad range of links between Concordia and the Montreal that it belongs to as a public institution. And so this is, as part of my work is anchored in the mandate of our office. A lot of the work that I do is in the realm of popular education and community organizing. And in doing our work, we've been increasingly inspired by models in other universities that recognize the importance of decentralizing the university and its educational mandate. And to also commit to a process that's relational when we seek to affect change in communities that we want to work with. And so my presence here at Batiment is a presence that really seeks to listen and to understand, and it's a starting point for the kinds of brokering that I might engage in afterwards, where I'm then tasked to go back to the university and see with whom there's the possibility of creating something that concretely meets the needs that are here at Bâtiment 7. Sometimes it's work that slows things down a little bit. Yeah. We'll get calls from folks within the university who want to do projects out of here. It's a project that's pretty hyped right now in our context, and so a lot of people are excited about Bâtiment 7, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's reason enough to come down and do stuff. And so, there were profs who heard that we had a presence here, and they asked, well, can we come and teach out of here, which certainly validates the importance of the space, and it's the sheer educational potential that it holds. So yeah, I think so. Teaching out of here, I get where it's coming from, but bringing a bunch of students and setting them up upstairs in the atelier doesn't really contribute a whole lot to the folks that are here. And so in that context, it's my role to kind of unpack that a little bit with the instructor. Say, well, what's driving your interest? Is there a way to have a co-creation component as part of coursework, and to see if that might be a way to actualize those good intentions, but in a context of something that maybe has a little bit more meat on it.
This is probably a good time to give you a bit more context in terms of where the building is located. This neighborhood, sometimes just called The Point, is situated southwest of downtown Montreal. It's bounded by two expressways, the St. Lawrence River and the Lachine Canal, and extensive rail yards. That's to say, it's a very contained area with pretty clear boundaries.
What started off as an agricultural area run by sharecroppers quickly developed under industrialization into a busy working-class neighborhood. It was home to a lot of new Canadians, especially Irish Catholics. Between the rail yards, the bridges, and eventually the autoroute, the neighborhood developed quickly. This was one of Canada's first neighborhoods to offer workforce housing, and this included the introduction of British-style stacked duplex housing that would eventually come to be so typical of neighborhoods all throughout Montreal.
In addition to this housing form, a kind of grassroots solidarity formed in this and other working-class neighborhoods in the city, especially as industry declined in the 1960s. For example, in 1968, the Clinique Communautaire de Pointe-Saint-Charles was founded in order to provide healthcare and social services to locals, taking this kind of care outside of the jurisdiction of religious-affiliated agencies such as the Catholic Church, which kind of had its paws in everything at that point. This clinic inspired the model that eventually went on to be used throughout the whole province, the CLSCs, or Local Community Service Centers. There are now 147 of these centers throughout the province. What other models developed in such conditions might we learn from?
Like many central urban neighborhoods, Pointe St. Charles is changing rapidly. Bâtiment set is a response to and engagement with that change. It was the change members of that neighborhood felt they needed to do themselves.
Alex gave us a brief rundown on the building's industrial heritage.
Yeah, so these were all buildings that were used to manufacture parts for trains. Yeah, so this was a pretty active and lively site that directly connects to the history of Pointe St. Charles as a point of entry for trade and manufacturing coming into Montreal. And so it's on that basis alone, it's great that it's been maintained as a heritage industrial site, and that we're now seeing Pointe St. Charles residents really owning it.
Right now, the space includes a cooperative grocery called Le Détour, a cooperative microbrewery and pub called Les Cent Tavernes, which we learned produce some delicious and punny beers, a youth-run cooperative arcade, and a cooperative metal shop. There are also a bunch of other projects that are either currently run through the space or in the works, such as a wood shop, a long-standing neighborhood art school, a bike shop, a car shop, and a lot more. You should just follow the project. The links are in the show notes, because there's a ton of space and plans. And this is, in some ways, just the beginning. Let's go back to our conversation with Alex. We asked him to share with us some projects that are currently unfolding at Bâtiment set with the university.
So there's a few projects that we're working on right now that I'm pretty stoked about. So we've been with Mark, we're in contact right now with the folks from the Sustainability Action Fund to see if there's a way to hold student-led initiatives here at Bâtiment set that are committed to social sustainability, but are also co-created with folks from here and are committed to engaging with the Pointe St. Charles community. We recently brought in a bunch of furniture and equipment from the Concordia furniture graveyards through the Center for Creative Reuse at Concordia. Mm-hmm. And so that was something that was a great win-win for both parties. Concordia was able to really clear stuff out, and this is furniture that's going to be actively used in this context. I've been in touch with Israel Dupuis, who's a prof in design, about bringing some of his students in the context of a course on design and community engagement. There's a prof, Satoshi Ikeda, who's working on food securities. We've been talking about bringing the students down next week. And in that context, these students come, they do their 3 hours a month at Le Détour, and then they work on special projects while they're here. Next week, there's Concordia has has a program called Community Compass, which takes place during our March break, and so we're going to have probably about 10 students. They're going to come and they're going to do some heavy lifting in relation to the new initiatives that are going to be coming up to the Grand Atelier. So it's still. I've been here about 6 months now, and initially we had thought, okay, well, it's going to take at least a year just of being here before things really start. This hasn't been the case. I feel like as soon as I got here, there was a lot of interests. There's a few factors. So we knew the folks from Bâtiment said from before. We first started to know Bâtiment said. Why I knew them from having lived in the Point before. My director Charmaine is a Point St. Charles resident, so she knows the folks that are around here. And we first worked with Bâtiment said in the context of an urban design conference called the Next City Vanguard, which Concordia hosted in 2016. And then afterwards, we started to say, okay, well, what would it potentially look like for us to keep connecting to Concordia to Bâtiment said. And it took about a year of meeting with Judith and the other folks to slowly talk about it before we were invited in. But for a while, we couldn't come in. We're not ready.
We asked Alex to reflect on the buzzwords that tend to circulate around projects like this.
As I see it, smart cities is something that's adjacent to social innovation as a practice. And it's a practice that tends to come along with some really, really great intentions, but sometimes a lack of connections to the context that it seeks to impact. And sometimes it raises a pretty big potential in missing the mark for the sake of applying the expertise and the intentions and the access to capital of the folks who are proposing either social innovation or smart cities commitments. And so I think in that context, popular education is always positioned as a ground-up community building strategy where you recognize that speaking with the folks that are around you and acquiring the kinds of community organizing skills that are sometimes very modest, but allow us to understand what it means to be anchored in a physical context that we can shape and affect by our presence. And so popular education, I think in this context, is also allowing for the site to be an experimental vehicle for popular education. So the stuff that I find tends to miss the mark is when social innovation tries to annex the language of social justice. And so there's this strong narrative that we need to value professionalization and expertise in the context of applying commitments to change, and I think that fails to miss the mark, because successful and impactful social movements are not led by big thinking disturber, change maker, disruptors. They're led by moms, they're led by families who do kitchen table community organizing and show up in the street, and speak to power, but from a position of groundedness. And so from experience. And so it's the idea that we hold vulnerabilities that are acknowledged, and it's in seeking other people who hold similar vulnerabilities that we can in some ways celebrate what they represent and create something that belongs to us and that's not imposed on us. At its worst, I think social innovation has found a very clever way to capitalize on poverty, to monetize on poverty. There are some very specific local examples that I think reflect that. But there are also times when I really like social innovation for its capacity to celebrate design. The city studio model in Vancouver is, in my opinion, a very, very effective means of taking something that doesn't necessarily pretend to engage in anything that's within the realm of socioeconomic. It just takes students that have an affinity for design, and it connects them to localized needs in neighborhoods. And the role of the City Studio Hub as essentially a space in which a number of different universities and colleges in Vancouver have invested is responsible for walking with those projects to make sure that they're developed and applied with a good set of best practices, and to then take whatever has worked the best and to scale it up, but throughout the city of Montreal. So that to me is the kind of design-driven, design-focused social innovation that hasn't necessarily bitten more than it can chew.
We asked him to talk a little bit about replicability, given that this is a unique heritage site in a particular neighborhood context.
Well, what I like about the Bâtiment set model is the tenacity of it. And so there's a strong learning that we can draw from this that allows us to recognize that street-based action can morph into institutional commitments. Once something like Bâtiment set has been created, it ceases to be a conceptual framework. It's something concrete that folks can visit and understand and then replicate. There are similar vacant heritage sites all over the city. I think by virtue of it now existing, then there is that potential for cross-pollinating that maybe wouldn't have been there before.
Another aspect of the project that is, in some ways, independent of the site and context and could provide some inspiration to projects with similar mandates is how the organization is run.
But yeah, it's its own unique model. Anna Krasinski played a big role in creating the model so that it really committed to autonomous governance principles. It's not the kind of collective where everyone needs to be involved in decision-making on every aspect, but where there's a number of sub-hubs that each hold a specific mandate. And so if you're sitting on a hub, what we call des cercles, if you're sitting on a circle that's mandated to look at neighborhood engagement, and you make a decision that relates to the inclusivity hub, then it's your responsibility to check in with those folks and to run whatever project you want to develop by them. And then there are instances for us to report back on the work that's happening in the circle so that anybody who wasn't consulted can call it out or can provide inputs. But for sure, I think the model in and of itself is worth recognizing as a really, really interesting new concept and something that would also be a pretty deep departure from the kinds of top-down approaches that we might find in the smart cities narrative,
And
in universities. What I like about this is that it's there are very few presumptions as to what this is going to lead to. This is a model that we envision based on two models specifically. One is the work out of the Office of Community Engagement at Simon Fraser University, and the other one is work that's being done in a similar anchored site out of Station 20 West, out of the University of Saskatoon. And in both cases, you really commit to shedding your expectations when you step into a site that isn't really yours in any way. I'm a guest here, and so I need to conduct myself accordingly.
That was Alex Megelas at Bâtiment set. You can check out his website and see all the things he's up to. While we were at Bâtiment set, we wandered around looking for Pascal. We ended up catching up with him later in the week by phone. We wanted to get a little background on the history of the project. Our interview was conducted in French.
Oui, parfait.
We're going to post the complete interview for those of you who understand the language. But for now, we'll try to translate some of the main elements of our conversation with Pascal.
Je m'appelle Pascal LeBrun, je suis résident de Pointe-Saint-Charles depuis 18 ans.
Pascal LeBrun is an anarchist organizer and longtime resident in Pointe-Saint-Charles. He's been living and working in the neighborhood for almost 20 years. He's also currently pursuing a PhD at the University of Ottawa in political science, where he's considering the economic philosophy of anarchism.
We started by asking him about the history of the project. It's a long, interesting story that started in the early 2000s.
So, Canadian National Railway had these massive properties. They represent about 1/3 of the neighborhood's total surface area. And in 2003, they closed their operations, and this created a huge opportunity for development in the neighborhood. A local developer was able to secure the lands for $1 and considerations for the environmental remediation of the properties.
In 2005, plans were proposed for a big casino project with players like Cirque du Soleil and Lotto Quebec, but this was met with popular resistance. People mobilized against this project, which compelled the government to withhold its endorsement, and, amidst the controversy, Cirque du Soleil pulled out. The plan for the casino project eventually dropped. This gave way to a moment of community self-reflection, where people thought about what needed to be done with the vacant space.
So at the time, a lot of small shops and spaces meant to meet the needs of local people, like coffee shops, started to close because of increasing rents. So they decided what they needed was some kind of self-managed community center where people could meet. And they wanted to leverage what they knew about European squats that endured for a long period of time, such as Copenhagen's Freetown Christiania. In 2009, they organized a squat on the last industrial building along the Lachine Canal, but were promptly removed despite the numbers of people involved, which were in the hundreds.
They decided with the help of other community actors to reorient the project towards the CN yards, which had not yet been completely subsumed by developers.
One building was interesting from a heritage perspective, but also just given its size and potential for community activities. That building was building number 7.
A variety of actors came together around the site: local anarchist organizations, community groups, and an art institution with experience in the rehabilitation of abandoned industrial sites called the Darling Foundry. In 2009, the general elections changed the political situation, leaving an opening for discussion. The owner of the building had plans to develop the site, but the borough refused the zoning change, putting an end to those intentions. In 2011 and 12, the building was ceded along with $1 million in repairs to the community. After years of intervening by various government actors, the community got the building in 2017 so that they could have a place to organize their collective lives outside the capitalist system, where market prices were pushing them outside of their own neighborhood.
As we mentioned previously, we'll post the full interview with Pascal LeBrun in French, so you can get more details on the project right from the source. He goes into a lot more details about the context and the community actions, so give it a listen if you can.
We also spoke with this woman.
So my name is Shauna Janssen. I'm right now in life an assistant professor here at Concordia University in Montreal in the Department of Theatre, and also just actually recently approved as an affiliate of the Department of Geography, Planning and Environment. And as well, I direct the Institute for Urban Futures here at Concordia, and I also hold a research chair, a Concordia University research chair, new scholar in what I call performative urbanism.
Can you tell us what performative urbanism is?
Damn. Well, you know what? Actually, some of the ways I've been describing it, there's a new website that some students have been helping me work on, because it kind of just gives us a place to announce ourselves as a team of researchers, and also archive some of the things we're doing and hoping to do. Well, the term actually is also the title of a book that was written by architects about 4 or 5 years ago, and so their take on this comes from very much an architectural perspective, I guess is what I would say. And I come from, my background is working in the live arts and performance, and mostly in theater, but also in other performing arts like even opera and dance. And so part of the work, I think my research has been about really is thinking about these performative events in the city that are of certain kinds of scale. So we can think of like the Quartier des Spectacles, that very large macro scale kind of eventful performatives of space and public spheres, to some more micro activisms even that I'm really kind of interested in, because a lot of the, I think, core of where the work for me comes from is thinking about questions of the right to the city and questions of democracy. It's just the beginning, and I think I don't know exactly what it is. I know it's not a discipline. I don't even think it's a methodology necessarily. I do think it's a lens for understanding different kinds of interactions in the built environment, and how space is being used, even actually understanding the performative agency of the built environment itself. Understanding, our way through the city that, is, non-normative, normative. So I think performativity is a great lens because it lends itself to seeing things in action or iterative, and not the same thing is repeated necessarily twice either. So it's really, so that's maybe more conceptual. So figuring out that relationship to, maybe it's also thinking about the performance of urbanity, maybe another way of thinking about it, but it all kind of is rooted in, maybe more thinking about the urban turn, in performance. Like it's been said for years by many, many people and decades, from different perspectives around theater and performance studies that, there's the Shakespeare, all the world's a stage, but there's also, the drama of, the social life of the city, the drama of the city. I mean, these are not new, this city as stage, like these are not new ideas, but I'm actually more interested in kind of getting to a more granular, the politics of that, and coming through, fine arts too. So also looking at, the way that art isn't, and artists aren't necessarily, for what they do in the city, is not a solve for, and it's not about solving, the problems of the city or of a neighborhood, but that it's part of contesting, that it's a practice in kind of contesting some of these problems, especially if we think about gentrification, the reuse of, especially in a city like Montreal, of its post-industrial, deindustrialized sites and spaces. And I think that's a lot of where this work came from too. But one always needs like a sexy, framework, right? So one always needs to put out a sexy kind of frame for something, and Concordia right now is, as major strategic direction is, cities and having a cities hub. So I feel very lucky and privileged to be able to have this time to explore what that might mean, and I'm actually really excited also by, a lot of the students that are around that, we all seem to kind of not be able to always articulate it, but then, we have a salon and I have 7 students present some of their work, and somebody's presenting, the DIY bike lanes they're creating in Guadalajara, and the risk that was involved in doing something like that, and, that fell under this rubric of performative urbanism, or, another student's looking at the emergent queer sites in the city and mapping that and the anonymity of that, and has like 28,000, people writing from all over the world, their stories of that experience in the cities where they come from. That's Lucas La Rochelle. What else? I have another student that I'm a researcher working with who's doing work in city gardens and comes from choreography, choreography background. So it's fun when you come from theater and performance background to think about, that application of the performative or the scenographic in a different way. But the work is to really think of, how do you make that meaningful? What are the ethics of that? But it's fun to kind of see its application, like remove ourselves from the historical presence of the stage is over there, and let's is this a different, how could this work?
Yeah, so it sounds to me like when you're talking about a lens, it's kind of like viewing citizens and people who are in the city as players rather than as consumers or as users of a system, but they're active agents, possibly agents of change and engagement. Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. Yeah, absolutely. That's really helpful for me too.
We asked Shauna to tell us a little bit about her doctoral work, which was centered on another urban neighborhood just south of downtown Montreal called Griffintown. Located just across the canal from Point St. Charles, the neighborhood we were just talking about before, Griffintown was, like Point St. Charles, populated in the 19th century by laborers, many of whom were new Canadians, and these people helped to build the Lachine Canal, the port, and other major pieces of the city's infrastructure. And they eventually went to work in the many factories that lined the Lachine Canal. This was an area of heavy industry until the mid-1900s, when the St. Lawrence Seaway opened up and the canal lost its role as a major transport artery for the country. For a variety of reasons, the neighborhood shifted towards light industry, and for many years, fewer people called Griffintown home, as residential buildings were gradually replaced with light industrial spaces. In October 2012, the City of Montreal revealed plans concerning the revitalization of the area, which included building dozens of condos in the area, ranging from 10 to 20 stories high. And in 2014, Griffintown was made part of an ongoing movement to introduce a Quartier de l'Innovation, an innovation district, to the southwest of Montreal, and this was designed to promote and encourage economic development for district residents, but also for Montreal as a whole.
You know, that neighborhood was introduced myself to that neighborhood when it was just about to transform quite drastically into what we see it as now. Massive condoville, massive gentrification. But it was actually through the eyes of artists who were in residency at the Darling Foundry. And, you know, they had their studio space there, but they were also part of their practice. They were kind of interdisciplinary in their approaches to many things about the city and the built environment. But one of their approaches was to make these public interventions. And they started to actually, you know, leave the building of the Darling Foundry and start to work in the neighborhood. And the neighborhood at that time, you know, had this very abandoned, I wouldn't say it was vacant at all, but it had a very abandoned feeling to it. So there's a lot of the deindustrialized sites and a lot of speculation going on, a lot of weedy parking lots because, you know, there were homes there at once, but because of, you know, Expo 67 coming, they cleared all of those places. So you were looking at a neighborhood that was just about to, there wasn't a lot of planning in terms of amenities to come in, but it was mostly about the condos. I got really interested in, you know, the way that, again, you know, artists in certain interventions, you know, somehow illuminate and certainly not stop that train of gentrification that's already on its way, but it was certainly about trying to capture a moment in time and space in terms of that change and that transformation, and to reflect on that critically. So I invited 12 different artists, and I say 12, but there was more because some were more collective groups of people and some were individuals, to engage with different sites in the neighborhood. And I thought it would actually be a lot more within the interior of some of the built environment that's still there at that time. But in fact, a lot of the work started to happen kind of in between. So, you know, in a cul-de-sac, you know, there was a short 25-minute performance work created in response to the overall coming gentrification, but also kind of drawing from the archives and history of working class history of the neighborhood. Or, you know, I had a multimedia artist, Alison Loader, fabulous artist, video animation artist, create a work actually in response to the myth of the ghost of Mary Gallagher, right? Yeah. And you know how I think there's a ghost walk every 7 years. I can't remember which cycle we're in right now with that, but in fact, you know, you think, okay, yeah, so what? Like, why do you want to do that? But what was great is that, you know, there was a built-in critique. She brought up the gender and class issues of that time. So we're looking at something a little bit deeper than, you know, just the ghosts, but, you know, she was able to mediate that in a really interesting way.
So there is this legend of Miss Mary Gallagher, a prostitute who was brutally murdered in 1879. It said her spirit returns to William Street every 7 years in search of her head. It's been over 90 years since the last sighting. Some suggest that she's actually an allegory for the neighborhood itself, and like her, it seemed to just disappear one day.
But I think what was attractive to me is, like, it's very easy to fall into kind of being nostalgic about what was somewhere, but in fact, in the same breath, I would say, you know, in fact, part of what I'm interested in is also what are these futures of these sites, you know. So part of that work, again, you know, I want to emphasize was not, you know, not happening to stop the gentrification whatsoever, but to kind of address that, you know, to remember God, it's so funny. I feel like I should be ripping out a page of the dissertation. You know, it's such a long time ago.
Yeah.
But I think as for me, the work, actually, the learning curve, the work was, you know, I learned so much about what it means to engage publics in like a lot of it was actually, you know, the outcomes were really discursive. Like people were invited to come down to a site that felt like it was in the middle of nowhere and they'd never been there before, and so they find their way and they're like, oh my God, it took me so long to get here. I got lost, but I've never been down here before. What's going on down here? And so part of that work is, you know, generative of those kinds of dialogues and kind of getting people maybe more involved in thinking about what's going on in their city and how that might impact them. And I think that there's all sorts of ways art can do that, and there's all sorts of ways that art has failed to do that. And, you know, but I mean, for me, it was, you know, this is something I pass on to my students now, you know, in terms of what is the practice in terms of responding to sites, and also, you know, sometimes even be able to transpose what's happening in that site somewhere else. And so thinking about how we're doing what we're doing was a big part of that.
She shared with us her implications with the Bâtiment set project.
It was through the invitation of actually Alex and Charmaine at the Office of Community Engagement here at Concordia. They reached out to the Institute for Urban Futures, to us, to say that, you know, they had, as we know, there's kind of like that first 30% of the 1/3 of the building kind of has been repurposed already on the interior, and so they were interested in, you know, seeing what we could do, explore, collaborate, bringing around other students and faculty to think about the future of the exterior. So there was a lot of on the table right away. Kind of was like an invitation to pretty much figure out what kind of charrette we could have that would look at very practically, you know, what would it take, what would a blue alley look like here? What would a green alley look like here? How does that relate to what they know is all right, like what's already on the interior in terms of usage, and you know, the future of that the health clinic, the birthing center that's a part of that, the desire for food security, which would then feed into the épicerie that's already there. You guys know that, and that co-op.
A design charrette is a short, intense, organized, participative design activity, typically with a range of stakeholders. In this kind of event, people collaborate to work on a creative problem. Like in this case, the utilization and proposed design of the exterior of the site.
So I was like, wow, yeah, very cool. And also there's the, you know, imminent development, the developers that are right there on that side of the lot too. So they were kind of looking for, there was multiple, I think, multiple ideas of engagement. And so I immediately thought, well, like, it would be really cool to have a charrette. And I immediately think about, not being a designer myself though, but like thinking about like, well, you know, how, and what really stood out too is like the anchor there, as you guys know, is the collective autonomy, and also those models of like circular economies, and super interesting to kind of learn more about those in a really concrete way by like just being there on site. So I was really excited about bringing some students through the Institute to look at that, and design students too. And so I invited Carmela Cucazella and Alice Jarry, who are teachers, professors in design here, because I knew they also had access to students who have these drawing skills as well. And then I had a few, you know, community engaged, socially engaged types of folks that I work with also be a part of that. So I was really excited about, you know, exploring that, but also making this a way to introduce all of us, you know, not just the students, but all of us and the students to some of these ideas, these values that they're anchored, that the B7 is anchored in, and also be able to meet some of the stakeholders who are, you know, largely responsible, Marcel, Natasha, like real leaders in the community for years, because that Point St. Charles has, you know, a huge history of activism, and it's not just like one group of people. There's a multiple groups of people doing different things. So So we entered into a charrette process in early November, and that was really a first kind of meeting with certain people who've been a part of building the Bâtiment set project that it is now, and kind of getting like a real overview of that work, that history, that initiative, and also where they're at now and what's at stake. And so what was really at stake was this thing about the exterior of the landscaping of the exterior, and understanding what part the city actually still owns, what part the city says they're going to be able to get to, basically give over to the Bâtiment set folks, and then kind of wanting to look at best and worst case scenarios. So that's kind of what the students were working on from that point on, and we've had a couple of other meetings, and we did something at Fourth Space as part of the city's programming in the new year. Where we're at now, I think, is like actually for me a question is thinking about what did we learn from this process and where could we go next. The students were great, but it's interesting in my observation to see like because we did work when we were working in situ, like it's just a different thing going on.
What do you mean?
Well, like, and it might not even be that, some of the stakeholders are there on that day, but being in situ, I mean, you can't get away from the problem or the problematic that you're dealing with, right? It's a different charged experience, and maybe this is where the problematic you've been asked to deal with is actually performing on you somehow. There's a different vibe. It's very different. There's some form of agency that you can't put your finger on because you're in the building, you're in the site. Mm-hmm. That you've heard all these stories about how it came to be, how it came to pass, and what it is now. And now you get to kind of work here, draw here, maybe look out the window at the lot, go back inside, draw, talk to some other people. Mm-hmm. So for me, it's like the design process involves. There's so many elements to actually, engage with that, I suppose. And I don't know if that's like, standard or not. But then, not doing the work of drawing and rendering there, but we're doing it like, here in a room on campus, which happens to be our lab space, which is fine. I don't know, the energy changes. Mm-hmm. And I feel like there's a disconnection. There's just like, it's I'm oversimplifying it by saying you're just connected differently, but spaces talk to you. I mean, that's what I believe. That might sound really flaky, but they do if you spend enough time there, right? And it's not, and I don't mean that in a nostalgic way, but materials and spaces have their stories too, right? So all these different things that we were a part of and the students were a part of was super cool in the sense of. You're meeting people who've put the time and resources and labor, and the precariousness of that too, right? Because you guys have gotten part of that story, I think, a little bit, and then and understanding those stakes in a real kind of embodied way, and that being involved in the design process isn't just having the skill to draw, or maybe not even being about designing in the way we think of design. Like, what about the social practice or what's the spatial practice of that?
We asked her to comment on what we might learn from the Bâtiment set project.
Again, what's good for one neighborhood, city, community in a neighborhood may not be something that works for another, right? But I think if you're thinking about it, I think, there's certain sensibilities or an ethos around things like the circular economy, that there is doing things with a kind of activism or a resistance to large-scale gentrification. Like there can be some common values that can be shared, right? Like, I think people can share sensibilities that can work across a lot of territory, probably. So, I'm actually more interested in processes than these kinds of models that become like these, I think processes can have an impact too, But unfortunately, sometimes I think process kind of tends to be seen as something that's not as impactful or harder to measure. I think it's important to think about, certain processes that kind of spin out, right? A model, I associate a lot with staticness and a kind of fixity. And so as long as there is something else that keeps things percolating for them, and that can happen in many different ways, right? It can happen through the co-op, it can happen a whole bunch of different ways the way they have their setup. More of something that's constantly a little bit agitated, and that doesn't have to be a bad thing. Shaking things up, agitation, right? Yeah, it's a really good question. To be perfectly honest, as you kind of know, I'm trying to figure it out because, I'm trying to align myself with that, and I'm on a big learning curve trying to get, different understanding of even where the term came from and, where things started. And there's a great scholar we have here in sociology anthropology department, Orit Halpern, who I actually just spoke to really recently. And, a way into thinking about the smart cities is actually thinking about smartness and this is, really her talking to me, but I'm going to share it. Smartness in its many different kinds of machinations. So that we can, if we are feeling a little technophobia or even technophilia, that we're able to kind of think about it more than, more than just the building and more than just these kinds of these imposed infrastructures. So, how do we think about a project like Bâtiment set being a smart one? Well, it's, what's the smartness? What's smartness there? I think would have to do with, intergenerational collaboration. Would be one, I guess, example. I think that the thing is like breaking down. There's this. I'm trying to figure out what the discourse is even on smart cities. It seems to want to prepare us for something that, is really actually never going to happen, right? It's like it's always this thing that's about testing and it's kind of, I think, it's all trying to deal with a certain kind of uncertainty. And again, my big question, it's a big sweeping blanket one, is like, what is the impact on the right to the city? This is a question that I ask, and who's it for? And these are really big, broad questions, but they're a place that I've started to work with in terms of, talking to people about what really matters to them.
That was Dr. Shauna Janssen, Assistant Professor of Theatre and Concordia University Research Chair in Performative Urbanism, as well as Director of the Institute for Urban Futures.
So, are you looking forward to neighborhoods that are planned by Google? What about neighborhoods that are planned by the neighborhood? What about a mix? Let us know what you think. You can reach us on all the various platforms, Facebook, Twitter, Medium, but they're only social if you make them social.
If you want to just sit back and listen, that's fine too. You can subscribe to The Worlds We Want on iTunes, Spotify, Google Play Music, and all those other platforms. Please leave us a review if you like the show, so that other people like you can find us. Writing and editing by Cheryl Gladu. Thanks to all our guests for taking the time to talk with us. Music featured in this episode is Are You Well by Best Fern.